All right.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the NCMC's newest music appreciation program, Listen to This, A Beginner's Guide to 20th Century Classical Music. I'm Andrea Wolfleff, the Director of Operations here at the NCMC. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and also thank you to Nick Davies for putting this whole program together. Thanks so much, Nick. We would, the NCMC would also like to thank the generous underwriters who made this program possible, many of whom made their donations in memory of Andy Bullington, for which we are extremely grateful. Many of you probably know Nick as a clarinetist and have seen him performing here at the NCMC when he isn't performing with orchestras and ensembles around the country. Tonight, though, he's here in a different capacity, helping us all better understand and appreciate classical music of the 20th century. He's well qualified to do this, holding a BA in music from Rice University and a Master's of Music from the University of Southern California. So Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. So before we begin, I just wanted to say, again, thank you to all of you for coming. If you have not received a syllabus today for the course or the selected readings, we will be sure to send it to you afterwards. There are two books that are not required for this, I should say, but I would highly recommend reading. Again, they're on the syllabus, so you can write them down now or you could look at them later. But they are The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross. He is a writer for The New Yorker, just a wonderful music critic and an incredible deep dive into many of the subjects that we're going to cover here today and in future weeks. And the other book is What to Listen For in Music by the composer Aaron Copland. And again, it is an excellent, easy read that's good for the layperson and the musician alike to really sort of be able to think about music in new and different ways and perhaps sort of gain insight onto what the composer's intent was. For all of these classes, I'm hoping that you, the audience, will feel free to ask questions, to type it in on the message or to verbalize your questions. I should be able to answer your questions here as we go along. I'm seeing that I have a Deborah Van Dyke who has raised your hand. I'm gonna guess that may have been unintentional, but if not, let us know. But in any event, there are going to be parts of this where I pause and ask questions about, just to see if you're all checking in with me, we're all on the same page, so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's delve in. Let's see. All right, so again, my name's Nick Davies. I'm a clarinetist and a composer by trade, so to speak. And this is, really, I guess, something that has been interesting me for a very long time. Because you see, there are so many times in my performance career where I'm asked by audience members, do you like the music that you're performing? And this is a question that's posed to me more often than not when it's a piece of music written after 1900. And there's little do those poor people know that they're tugging out a question and a sort of set of responses that is larger than they possibly could imagine, because it could be yes, right? It could be yes, I love this piece by John Cage I'm playing. No, I absolutely detest this piece by Morton Feldman that I'm playing. It could be anything, but it's more than that. It's about what is the purpose and what is the nature of art, and what is the intent of the composer? What is the thing that we're trying to communicate now in the 20th century and now in the 21st century? So that's the angle that I'm coming from as the performer and the composer. Now, in order to help you understand the music that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing sort of a contextualization of the music through the lens of politics, through literature, through art, visual art, that is. And we'll also be dispelling, I think, one of the most sort of benign but pernicious myths about music, which is that it is a universal language, because music is not a universal language. And let me give you an analogy to explain why. If I were to present an apple to any one of you, and you would be able to tell me through sight and through taste whether or not it was a good apple. You could tell me it was, if it was shiny, you could tell that it had a nice glow about it. You could tell me probably tell what variety of apple it was. You could tell me whether or not the texture was good. You could tell me any number of things about that apple because you know and are familiar with that apple. But let us say I presented you with a foreign fruit that you've never encountered before in your life. How could you be equipped to tell me what that fruit was supposed to taste like, what it was supposed to be like? How would you, in turn, say, take somebody who had never seen an apple before? How could they know what it was supposed to taste like? And this analogy can be directly applied to music. I'm seeing, I might have a question I can't in the chat. Yes, that's correct. This is coming directly, this is actually an analogy that has been presented to me before from Tolstoy. My argument, you could say, is a direct rejection of Tolstoy's argument. But this again could be applied directly to music because we are not familiar with every genre of music. We are not necessarily all equipped with the prior knowledge to understand music. And I'd like to also address this article that some of you may have read that I sent earlier by Christopher Small on musicking, which is a verb that he coined in the, I believe, 1970s. And what's important, one of the most important topics he covers is about how we see music essentially as a living museum today. Music's very different from other art forms. For instance, it requires time. It requires complete engagement. For instance, when you sit in front of a painting, you're not required to sit there for a full 40 minutes and appreciate it in all its glory. Whereas in a concert hall, of course, if you're sitting through a Beethoven symphony, you could leave, but that would, of course, there's all sorts of social stigmas, there's all sorts of physical barriers preventing you if you're in a seat in a live music situation. It's not like a book that you can put down. You're required to be there. It's a completely different experience. And not only that, but Small also attempts to sort of understand music in terms of the many activities that are associated with music. That is to say, it's not just the performance and the composer or the audience. It's also, the act of selling tickets. It's the act of putting together all the stands and the chairs and arranging the performance so it can happen. It's a ritual. And there's so many different ways that, I think that he allows us to sort of reconceptualize what the act of musicking is. And it's through that sort of philosophy and through, again, the contextualization that I'm hoping that we together can develop the tools to understand this extremely unique period of music. So what we're going to, let's see if I can get this to, there we go. So in order to address 20th century music, we need to address the subtitle of this talk, which is the end of common practice. Now, the question, of course, is what is common practice? This is essentially a system of conventions and styles that existed approximately between 1600 to 1900 in Western classical music. It is the style of writing that applies to Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, you name it. If they lived then, this is the style that they wrote in. This is the standard method for approaching harmony and music. And the way that we define it are through a couple of set parameters. And this is where we're going to get a little technical, and I definitely, if you are lost at all, please do let me know. So the first of which that we're going to define is functional harmony. Now, functional harmony is what we can define as the hierarchy of pitches and chords. For instance, in a scale, we know that no matter what, when we get through to the end of the scale, it has to end a certain way. It has to, it has to end right there, and that's what we call the tonic. It also implies what we call goal-oriented progression. Now, what that means is that through a series of consonant and dissonant intervals, which is to say the relationship between tension and release, there is a set of priorities within the pitches. So we know that when we get to the end, it's the end. So let's just take a simple chord progression. That is sort of the basis for all those 5 chords. That is the basis for all of this 1600 to 1900 common practice music, believe it or not. But the real crux of it is this, what we call a dominant chord, leading to the resolution. Now, there's different ways you can truss that up. You can have it say go. And this subversion of convention is what makes different styles have the flavor and the sound that they do. So it's about working within those parameters that all of these composers were able to have distinct voices. The other thing is that common practice music has clear rhythmic impulse. So for instance, when I sing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," you know that the following part's probably going to be "How I Wonder What You Are." There's a sort of, there's a predictability. You know that something is going to occur as a result of what you just heard. This ties in further with what we call phrase patterns. They are typically in Western classical music, they are either symmetrical or complementary. So again, in that small little segment that I so beautifully sung, you hear a question sort of and an answer. So twinkle, twinkle, little star, question, how I wonder what you are. Answer, ignoring the obvious grammatical error in what I'm suggesting. The musical package is suggested that way. And a great way of illustrating this is in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which I'm going to give you as an example of sort of this emphatic declaration of common practice of the tonic, of the relationship between all these pitches. You know where we're going, and he'll be damned if he doesn't get there. the conceit of this particular symphony is this idea of this inevitability of the fact that it starts in this sort of dark and stormy place, you know, and instead it winds up in this sort of triumphant, you know what, and it sort of it knocks you over the head with how clear and emphatic it is. Now, just, you know, about 10 years later, you have, or rather 30 years later, you have Chopin with this very early example of what we're going to call non-functional dissonance. Now, the difference between non-functional and functional dissonance is that in our chord here, we know that it's going to resolve. However, in this little example here of Chopin, you'll hear this very unusual series of notes in the lower end of the instrument. This sort of unresolved tension that it just permeates throughout this entire little excerpt I'm going to play. And this is sort of this type of music that I just played now is going to be the focus of how music shifts, this departure from a clear and decisive system of hierarchy. You could almost think of those little dissonant notes as decoration. It's sort of a little twinge, if you will. And now this is going to get us into all sorts of difficult questions over, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard the words tonal, atonal, post-tonal. We're going to be defining that as we go along, but for the time being, we're going to consider tonal, you know, anything that sounds more or less major or minor. That's sort of, yeah, that's where we're going to go from there. Sorry about that. So, to a little bit of a cultural and political overview of Europe at around the time that we're going to be focusing on for today. So that is 1850 to 1900. Politically, we have, I think most significantly, the 1848 European revolutions that happened in France and Germany, so on and so forth. And this, in part, was due to the growing middle class. There was sort of a discontent, especially as a result of the Industrial Revolution. We have public education becoming more widely available. And importantly for us, music as an entertainment was becoming more accessible. Things like opera, operetta by Johann Strauss and Gilbert and Sullivan were more and more important. And on top of that, as sort of a result of these revolutions, nationalism and conservatism were very much on the rise. You have the unification of Germany, which plays into Richard Wagner's career very strongly. He was a very, very strong nationalist. And you also have the standardization of language. So German, Italian, I believe French as well, these sort of very strict schools of how you're supposed to write, especially when considering all of the colonies that they had. There had to be sort of a systematized way of doing things. Now, conversely, in a place like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is made up of all sorts of diverse ethnic groups. So you have the Czech Republic, you have Hungary, obviously Austria. You have this sort of nationalistic effort within those countries to remain sort of, I guess, proud of, and again, heritage is important. But at the same time, the whole empire itself is trying to keep all these disparate groups together. Now, culturally, there was a real taste for mythology, which again you start seeing in Wagner's operas, especially The Ring of the Nibelung. Exoticism, we see this in the music of Tchaikovsky, of sort of actually really just generally interested in Russian and Asian music, and again, nationalism. And that's more particularly notable in those Austro-Hungarian countries I was talking about. I'm thinking of composers like the Czech Antonín Dvořák, or Leos Janáček, or even Franz Liszt from Hungary. And a couple of mile markers, if you will. We have the Vienna Secession in 1897. This is an artistic movement led by painters such as Gustav Klimt. And of course, we also have Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1899. So this is the atmosphere that we're sort of entering into here. Now, before I go on to continue with Wagner and so on and so forth, I want to ask if there are any questions we have regarding to my discussion on common practice or any of the things we just addressed here. Oh, looks like everybody got it. Great. So Richard Wagner is probably, I mean, there are a few figures who I could say are as influential even today in the musical world, and for reasons that we'll see, his music completely changed the landscape of Europe, culturally, musically, and also politically. It just had such an impact. So Wagner was born in Leipzig in Prussia, because Germany did not exist at the time, and he was born into a family that was interested in the theater. He actually, as a boy, participated in a number of, what would you say, community theater productions. His early music was very traditional, very conservative for the time, influences of Beethoven, Mozart, and Mendelssohn. And his operatic influence comes from is, I guess, viewed as very much a continuation of early Germanic opera by Carl Maria von Weber. And on top of that, he was influenced and given guidance by the French composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, who was the most important French grand opera composer of that era. For the most part, his early career was fairly unsuccessful. He eventually actually was put into political exile after the 1849 Dresden uprising. And in that time, he sort of, I guess you could say, couch crashed among his friends. And he was composing this whole time coming up. He was writing long manifestos on music, and also, unfortunately, on anti-Semitism. He was very much a proponent of a very pretty abhorrent anti-Semitic diatribe. And it wasn't until 1862 that he returned to Germany and began to have more quite substantial success as a composer and also as a conductor. Amongst his friends were some of the most influential people of the time: Nietzsche, the pianist and composer Franz Liszt, and Clara Schumann, the famous concert pianist, and also the then she was the what's the word? She was married to Robert Schumann, the composer, and he was also known to be a very colorful character. He faced chronic marital issues. He was constantly in debt. he was sort of a pariah if the multiple political exiles weren't evident. So the most influential opera that he wrote arguably was Tristan und Isolde. And it was an adaptation of the Irish, or rather Arthurian legend of Tristan, the Cornish knight, and Isolde, the Irish princess. And it's a story of forbidden love of basically Isolde is a stolen bride to be given to the king of Cornwall, who is the friend of Tristan. And along the way, they drink a love potion, they fall in love. And at the very end of the opera, when finally they are together, Tristan falls dead in ecstatic fulfillment of their love, and then she in turn sings for about 10 minutes to explain what's going on, because the sort of the dramatic crux of this opera is that their consummation of their love can only be found in death. And it was inspired by his affair with Mathilde Wenzendonck, with whom he was staying with her family during his first exile. Now, to sort of understand what makes this opera work, we're going to talk about the philosophy. Now, Wagner was an ardent admirer of Schopenhauer, who proposed that art was the reality of the human experience. It was the only real way of understanding humans. And this sort of was embodied by what he called the will. And this was something that Wagner took very much to heart and is present in all of his work, because he views art as, or rather music, as a universal or uniting art. Of course, again, mythology was very much an important part of Wagner's output. Of course, we have the Ring of the Nibelung, but two of his operas are based on Arthurian legend, which are, again, Tristan und Isolde and his last opera, Parsifal. And it's also important to mention that Wagner viewed art as if it were a religion. People refer to the attendance of one of his operas in the opera theater that he built in Bayreuth in Germany as a pilgrimage. I've heard people use this, in a non-ironic manner, is what it's referred to. And this is a sort of growing movement that had been happening at the time, really beginning with Beethoven. But this is sort of a cultish almost feel to the way that he perceived and others perceived his art. Next, we have this concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, which simply means complete work of art. And what this means is that his operas, he wanted to see them as a complete unification of all of the artistic forms. So you have, of course, theater, because opera contains it. You have the stage, you have the setting, you have the poetry in the words. He actually wrote all of his librettos, which was quite unusual for the time. And music is the thing that is sort of the drawstring for the whole package. In his tract, The Artwork of the Future, he had written this very important line: "The last symphony has already been written." And this is a reference to Beethoven, whom many viewed Wagner as one of the result of sort of the spiritual child or grandchild of Beethoven. And Wagner viewed instrumental music, for whom Beethoven had been the champion of. So, when I say instrumental music, I mean the symphony, I mean the string quartet, piano sonatas, instrumental sonatas, you name it. this was something that Wagner did. He barely wrote any, because he viewed it as a futile effort. It had already been done. Everything that could have been done, Beethoven already did. And so this music, his opera, this sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, all these types of things, this is the future of music. And I absolutely feel it necessary to mention his other less appealing tract, Jewishness in Music, in which he argues that essentially Jews, because they have no national character, because they are not necessarily members of one nation, in spite of the fact that many of these German Jews with whom he grew up with, he actually grew up in a German district in Dresden, that they were not sufficiently, I guess, invested in the music enough, and therefore were essentially parasitic. And this is something that would be carried on in a very pernicious manner throughout the following 100 years, all the way through the Nazi regime in Germany. But now, the way that Wagner manages to express these musical philosophy is through a number of musical features that we're gonna outline right now. So the first is the internal versus the external dialogue. Now, the music itself is supposed to express the inner emotions or sort of feelings of the characters on the play, and in turn, the dialogue that is sung is a way of putting words to those feelings and those thoughts. And so there's sort of this atmospheric quality that is rendered. The next thing that he introduced was this idea of the leitmotif. It's a simple way of explaining that each character or idea or place is given a recurring musical theme. And by this way, you sort of get this constructed musical story of one motif interacts with another and combines to form something else. And finally, you wind up with this large scale product. And in this particular opera, he uses an extensive system of tonal ambiguity and chromaticism to convey this unresolved yearning of these two star-crossed lovers. And what I mean by chromaticism and tonal ambiguity is unresolved tension. So in the very first part of the opera, we hear this sort of yearning theme. And this is probably these next couple chords, believe it or not, are considered the most important part of Wagner's progressive work in terms of what they did for tonality. Now, that's all well and good, but what does that actually mean? What would it mean if it actually resolved, let's say? But it doesn't do that. It does this. And this is sort of the idea. This is the musical idea, this constant yearning, this constant searching. And this all finally ends after 4.5 hours with this sort of almost, it's supposed to be inevitable that finally this tension is resolved. But it takes a very long time. And here at the very top, you'll hear that very, very first thing we heard at the beginning. So this is what this sounds like in the context of the opera. This is the Liebestod, which translates literally as love death, but can also be translated as transfiguration, from the end of the opera when, as I mentioned, Tristan drops dead and Isolde finally joins him in death. At this point in time, I again want to ask if there are any questions about Wagner, about this sort of philosophy. So this music and really the sort of philosophy of what it suggests really kind of put a wrench into the system. Because what it meant is that everybody was sort of required to take a stance against or with Wagner. And we have what is called the Brahms-Wagner polemic. We're not going to talk about Brahms today, but what essentially happened is that Brahms represented what we call absolute music, which is what we associate with Beethoven, this instrumental genre. Brahms never wrote an opera, and there's a good reason why. It's that it was this sort of belief in tradition. whereas Wagner was more of this programmatic style music, of music expressing something very specific. It was innovative, it was pushing boundaries. And so composers had to sort of, whether or not they liked it, whether or not they knew it, they were picking a side. And as we go forward, there is a renewed interest in music of the past. And this is complicating for composers because what it means is that not only are you having to sort of be reactionary or go with the flow, you have to compete now with a more diverse repertoire. You have to be in competition with music of the past, because you see, in the 1800s, anything that was programmed that was more than 20 years old was essentially considered ancient music. But past 1875, we were playing, music that included Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Bach, Monteverdi. It went all the way back, and that was part of what we call standard repertoire. And this created a shift in the expectation of the audience. Now, again, for the contemporary composer, there was a nationalist push, which I've been mentioning over and over again, but it's hard to emphasize how important it was. Within the German, Italian, and French spheres, which were the main bodies of music, it was really constricting to be a member of one of those groups. But from the outside, it was incredibly constricting in the sense that you had to show how not German, Italian, or French you were. And the result of all these sort of confluent strains is that it's difficult to find an individual style. You have to create a new work that can become a classic that will repeat in the audience hall and won't just be ditched to the nether of time. But you also can't depart too far from audience expectations. And by the same token, you can't be so predictable that the audience knows what's coming. And what this generally means is that there was an accelerated development of the abandonment or the extension of tonality. Again, tonality being or. And this results in the many isms of the 20th century. We have expressionism, impressionism, neoclassicism, primitivism, serialism, you name it, there's futurism, there's a million of them. And what they all boil down to is ways of reinterpreting and reinventing the compositional methods of the past. And we still to this day are reckoning with this transition. And what we can sort of generally classify this whole group of composers in sort of a slippery term, we can call them modernists. And one thing that it means, if it doesn't mean anything else, it does not necessarily mean that it is the most modern. It just means that there's a commitment or there is an optimism that progress is always for the best. And these composers we're going to talk about now fall into this category of this post-Wagner landscape. Before we address that, I'd like to give you a bit of a sort of a way of maybe thinking about this that's not just musical, because sometimes putting words to music is very difficult. And so one way we're going to do this is by looking at artistic comparisons. Now, the first one we have on the left is by Caspar Friedrich, whose Wanderer Over the Fogs or Over the Mists is probably one of the most famous romantic realist painters. There's a sense that we are seeing from the perspective of the subject, where it's almost like we're looking into what is his perhaps conscious thoughts, the unknown of who he is, of what's to come. This sort of, I guess you could call it almost pastoral spiritual, sincere transcendence, something even you could potentially even associate with Wagner. Next, you have Vincent van Gogh, the Impressionist, his self-portrait from 1889. This again, you can see clearly. You have these sort of almost surrealistic brushstrokes, these sort of suggestive colors, these emphasis on these shades, on these different variegations. Again, it's not a literal representation. It's more a suggestion of a mood or of an atmosphere. On the other hand, you have from surprisingly early, I should explain that music is often the last to follow in artistic movements. And that's because it just takes a lot longer to write a piece of music oftentimes than it does to write a book or to paint a painting. It just is always sort of at the very end of a movement. And we have this unusual decadent painter, Félicien Roth, who was he was fairly unknown at the time of his life. He was sort of within smaller circles, and it's pretty easy to see why. It is an emphasis on the satirical and the perverse. Pornocrates roughly translates to the ruler of fornication. And see, we have here what is presumably a prostitute being blindly led by a sort of a male bestial representation of sexuality. And on top of it, we have what we can consider symbolist tropes. You have these cherubs fleeing in despair. And if you look closely, you'll see the pig's tail is made of gold. And finally, from around the turn of the century, you have Gustav Klimt, the famous Austrian symbolist painter who we mentioned earlier from the Vienna Secession. This painting actually, if you think about it, is rather reminiscent of Tristan and Isolde. There's this sort of suggestive, intimate quality, these simplified organic forms, and it's opulent. It's this gilded aesthetic. And on top of that, it actually has an interesting sort of medieval twist. It almost is reminiscent of these illuminated manuscripts from the early Middle Ages, so on and so forth. But again, bear this in mind as we look at these future composers, because they are deeply and integrally tied to these movements. And I hope that they'll give you some way of interpreting the music you hear from a different angle. So the first composer that we're going to be speaking about is Debussy. He is, of course, the very most famous of the Impressionist composers, aside from Ravel. He was born in Paris to a sort of a modest income family, but he was admitted to the Paris Conservatoire at a very early age, and he always had a very complicated relationship with the institution because of the sort of what was viewed as subversive ways of composing music. Most influential to him in his early years were his acceptance of the Rome Prize, which was given by the Paris Conservatoire at that time. And he took a trip to Italy for this composition prize. He, I believe, kind of cheekily said that he hated all of the Italian music that he was hearing, the modern Italian music, and he actually developed an interest in medieval music and music of the Middle Ages from Italy. People like Pergolesi, Leonid and Peritin. And he also found formative his trip to Bayreuth. This is, again, Wagner's opera house. And he was, at an early age, he was an adamant Wagnerite. And he found this experience very disillusioned. He was disillusioned by his experience. And at the same time, it's hard to separate him from sounding Wagnerian, no matter how much he tried. And his reaction against Tristan und Isolde is found in his groundbreaking work, Pelléas et Mélisande, his symbolist opera based on the play by Maeterlinck, which again tells a story of star-crossed lovers. That sounds kind of familiar. And he was known, I think, most influential, his biggest influence was making sound itself part of music, not just harmony, not counterpoint, not all these various elements. It's the sound of an instrument. What does the sound of a flute against a harp, against a viola sound like? What is that timbre? Now, it's important to put Debussy's music in a little bit of a context. French-German relations around the time that he was composing and growing up were poor at best. We have the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, and there was a huge movement within France to assert itself culturally. We have what's called the Ars Gallica, the assertion of art as a cultural power. They did not want to seem as if they were old-fashioned. This is, and what results in sort of this, you have music by César Franck and Gabriel Fauré, who are the most important composers while Debussy was a young man, that incorporate music of the French Baroque, reaching all the way back to the 1600s and the early 1700s, that this music combines this French Baroque with Wagnerism, but also, in the case of Fauré, these sort of stagnant chords. If you have these chords in Wagner, what happens is that this music always wants to lead somewhere, right? It's all about the resolution. But for Fauré, he could just hang out here for a really long time and say, that's fine, or perhaps move to another chord that negates the impulse of that chord. So there's sort of this cool, reflective quality. As I'm saying, essentially, there's a reserved style. It's held back. It's influenced by dance. Ballet is an important cultural artifact of France. And above all, the music for Debussy was, and for many others, should be about beauty and about pleasure. And this is a really sort of a rhetorical objection to the Schopenhauer idea of the will, that there is this insistence that music has to have this resolution, this meaning. So for Debussy specifically, he was influenced again by Wagner, by the symbolist writer Stéphane Mallarmé, by Russian music, by medieval music that I've mentioned, and most interestingly, Javanese gamelan. This was music that was introduced to him in, I believe, the 1880s, 1890s, and it came to be an important part of his timbral aesthetic. Again, that sound itself of music, and this sounds something like this. Maybe not this. There we go. So we're going to do a bit of back-to-back comparison of gamelan ensemble with a work of Debussy's. So there's all these metallic instruments. This is what is comprised of a gamelan ensemble, these Balinese and Javanese East Asian music groups. Now here's an example of Debussy taking inspiration from this type of music. it's almost like they're clouds of sound that he's trying to evoke, sort of these images, reflets dans l'eau, the reflections on the water, these sort of supple sounds. So again, Impressionism and Symbolism are the movements that he is sort of most associated with. It's this idea of detached observation, the evocation of a mood, viewing one object from many angles. This, again, it's sort of more, rather than being told something, it's being implied. That's the idea, especially behind symbolism. This too is with the case of Debussy. He tries to avoid common practice harmony, that thing we've been talking about. Now, how he does that in a particularly clever way. He'll have a chord, say, and he'll move to it in an unexpected and non-functional way. And the point of this is to, again, evoke color. It's not about, oh, this is supposed to go some certain place. It almost just happens. This is against that, again, that Schopenhauer contra Wagner, the need to develop, the need to resolve, that it has to be about something. So here's a little example of this sort of aesthetic in the Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun, which was in its turn inspired by a poem by Mallarmé. You'll notice in the ballet, this was not originally a ballet, but it was inspired by inspired Nijinsky of the Ballet Russe to choreograph it, and you'll see these almost two-dimensional like representations by the ballet dancers. It is almost like you're watching hieroglyphics as a cartoon strip or something. That's how I think of it anyway. So again, we see this sort of these sort of lush harmonies that, again, even in spite of themselves, are reminiscent of Wagner in these just chromatic, sort of slippery harmonies. I don't know, it's hard to describe sometimes. So parallel to Debussy was Maurice Ravel. He was born in Cibourne, France, in Basque country, and he was born into more of a music-loving family than Debussy. And similarly, he went to the Paris Conservatoire, and similarly, he had a complicated relationship with them. It actually turned out that there was sort of a lot of political pulling of the strings, and Ravel never won this coveted Rome Prize that Debussy did, but it was because the head of the panel had kept on picking his own students, and thereafter the head of the panel was fired from the Conservatoire, and the aforementioned Gabriel Fauré took over. And in spite of all of this, Ravel was, after Debussy's death, the most important composer of France of the early 20th century. He was known in particular for his orchestration. Many of his pieces, of which he actually has a relatively small output, have versions both for orchestra and for piano. But the piece I want to talk to you about today is Jeu d'eau, which simply means the play of the water, or it could also translate to fountains, from 1901. This is of a similar vein to Debussy in that it's really focused on texture, extended harmony, these sort of what happens if you take a chord. We were just talking about, our chord here. What if we add a note? What if we add 2 notes? What if we add 3 notes? It can keep on going. And I'm sure to many of you that will sound a little bit like sort of almost like jazz. These really extended chords. Bill Evans, for instance, was hugely influenced by Debussy, and this is all jazz in itself was in its later years was influenced by this style. And in this particular piece, again, it's about these evocations that we were talking about, this sort of implication. The subtext for this piece, which I find I enjoy, is that Ravel says it's supposed to be a representation of the river god laughing as the water tickles him. You sort of get these almost spindly textures that coalesce and come together. It's incredibly evocative. So at this point, again, I want to ask if there are any questions before we move on to the German side of the coin. So, on the other hand, if that was the French reaction to Wagner, we have the Austro-German reaction. So the first example we have is Gustav Mahler. He was born in Bohemia, which was at that point part of the Austrian Empire, to a Jewish family. Later in his life, in order to be appointed to the Vienna State Opera, he actually had to convert to Catholicism, but he was known to have faced discrimination throughout his entire life. He was known actually as a renowned conductor above being a composer. He held positions in Vienna, Leipzig, Hamburg, the Met Opera, and he was also known to be a very exacting and difficult person to work with. Just again, for a little bit of context, it's interesting to know that he was a patient of Sigmund Freud's. And it's also sort of one of the things that's emphasized in biographies about him is his difficult family life. His wife was usually quite serially unfaithful to him. And on top of that, his children died at quite a young age. Now, he shows influence of both Brahms and Wagner. He is really very much part of this Wagnerian legacy of program music. And his main output, which was quite small considering his contemporaries, were symphonies and songs. He wrote nine complete symphonies, a 10th unfinished, and several collections of songs. He is known to have had this wonderful quote here that I've written: "To write a symphony is to construct a world." And that is the whole conceit of his musical output. This Weltanschauungsmusik is this idea of philosophy music, that music is a means by which to express a worldview, an ultimate reality. And this again can be tied back to Schopenhauer. So this movement that is associated with this style, this Weltanschauungsmusik, is maximalism. This is a means by which to deal with the problems that we were speaking of as a composer in the post-Wagner world. How do you deal with this changing landscape? And the solution for Mahler was a radical intensification of the means that you have as from the traditional angle. That is to say, harmony. That is to say, orchestration. That is to say, expansion of length. So to be clear, the length of many of these symphonies is at minimum an hour, and it involves an enormous orchestra. This particular symphony that I'm going to show you, the 10th symphony, includes 4 oboes, 4 flutes, 5 clarinets, 4 bassoons, 4 horns, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, tuba, a large enough percussion section that I did not deem it useful to list the whole thing right now, 2 harps and strings, a large string section. And that is a small Mahler symphony, really. It's also an expansion of the texture of these symphonies. If you have, let's say, you know, Mary Had a Little Lamb, you have the song, and then you have perhaps the accompaniment beneath it, just the harmony, you know, what you know are the implied notes behind it. With a Mahler symphony, you'll have sometimes it feels like every single instrument is playing its own individual line, and that is often true. But at the same time, you'll also have these incredible chamber music-like moments where you'll have maybe just the 4 principal strings, the 2 violins, viola, cello, playing a little string quartet in the middle of this huge symphony. And volume. This is another way of putting it. Sheer volume, the amount of noise that an orchestra can generate. And on top of this, as I've mentioned, there's this interest in increased tension and dissonance. Now, what that means in the context of this symphony is expanding conventional tonality. So we were talking about our chord here. But let's talk about this chord. Let's talk about the chord that it's supposed to resolve from. That chord, right? So in this context, this is the chord. What happens if we do what we talked about with Ravel? Let's add on a couple notes. Let's add some more. Let's add even more. Right? So we have this, I guess you'd say, a pressure, an increased dissonant pressure on these chords. So normally, whereas the chord may say, this one will resolve more like. So it's that pressure, that incredible pressure that is applied to the harmony of these chords that achieves probably the most important part of this maximalist movement, which is the idea of the sublime and the sensual. This idea of not only, it's sort of a spiritual ecstasy through music. Again, music is a religion. So let's see what that sounds like. So there you see how he has essentially really just hammered this idea home. And finally, when you get to that moment of release, it's even more sweet. Now, maximalism is sort of trickles even further into a movement we call decadence, which is what we're going to explore next. It is more of a literary and artistic movement. It deals with perversion and the flouting of social norms. And most importantly, it's the idea of sexual liberation in music. It is, in the case of many works, we were talking about these maximalist works being hours long. It takes these hours-long works, and as we'll see next week, puts them into potentially, you know, maybe 1-2 minutes, even potentially 30 seconds. It's this incredible sort of almost like describing an entire novel, like sort of a New York Minute novel. Again, this idea of this hypersensualization, and a good literary analogy for this is in Oscar Wilde, in the picture of Dorian Gray, and in Salome, his one-act play. Now, that play is turned into an opera by Richard Strauss in 1905. And Richard Strauss was a German composer born in Munich, in Bavaria. He was the son of Franz Strauss, who was a French horn player and a very conservative musician, so more on the Brahms side of this polemic. And so Strauss's early music shows influence of Schumann and Mendelssohn, these early Romantic composers. But when he heard his first Wagner operas in 1874, 1878, and 1879, he became a complete convert to this Wagnerian style. And similar to Mahler, he was a very successful conductor and also a successful composer. Strauss today is best known for his tone poems, which are essentially stories told in music without words. For instance, he has a tone poem of Don Quixote. He has his breakout work, which was Don Juan, which is the same plot as Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, about the ladies' man gone wrong, essentially. In his opera Salome, we have a continuation of this Wagner's operatic legacy, and it is not only a maximalist opera, it calls for an even larger orchestra than what I mentioned in Mahler's symphony, but it is also a decadent opera because of its subject matter. It focuses on portraying the character's psychology over the literal plot. Now, the plot of this opera is based on, again, Oscar Wilde's play that is inspired by the biblical figure of Salome. And the story takes place in the setting of a decadent society, which is Judea around 100 BC. And Salome, her father, who has imprisoned John the Baptist, who is referred in this opera to as Yochanan, has fallen in love with Yochanan, who refuses her advances. And ultimately, through trickery, she manages to have Yochanan executed. And the whole opera concludes with her finally kissing the head of John the Baptist in consummation. And funnily enough, this sounds, I'm sure you're very familiar, this idea of consummation of love through death, which this opera in many ways is viewed as the decadent, or really, I guess, the ultimate arrival of where Tristan und Isolde winds up. This is what happens when you take this to the extreme, the perverse extreme. Now, in this opera, Salome is sort of viewed as a threat to Christianity. She is a representation of Jewish rule in the time of in the biblical setting. Of course, the issue is that Christianity is viewed as the new, and Judaism is viewed as the old. And this is in a certain way the battle that is fought in the opera and can be seen as sort of a metaphor for the world in which Strauss was inhabiting, this confluence that would ultimately wind up in World War II. World War I, rather. Salome is an affirmation of earthly pleasure, of decadence. Necrophilia being sort of this ultimate iteration of what that could mean. And she is a destruction of the control that is held over her. And as I've mentioned, the musical features of this opera can be boiled down to a couple important features. Again, these psychological portraits of the characters. Wagner, or rather Strauss, much like Wagner, uses this leitmotivic development. Now, instead of assigning necessarily just themes to the characters, for instance, Salome's theme is as thus. One more time. But she's also given a tonal theme. So in the opening section of the opera, you'll hear the clarinet play the simple scale. And what that is essentially two scales combined, two tonal systems. And when you combine them together, they sound like this. So you end up with this sort of what we call a bitonal character, a bitonal music tonality. And the result of those two conflicting keys is kind of the entire opera, is this combination of these two opposing forces, which is represented when you come to the figure of Yochanan, who is represented like this. Very direction-oriented, very tonal. And what happens when finally they do meet one another in the final scene of consummation, we receive this clear combination of these various motives in what is known again as a bitonal combination. So of course, the dissonant part is what we're talking about. That's the important part. This combination of these two keys was the most sort of clear reference to this musical world that is moving beyond the tonal, and it's an incredibly apt moment for this perverse Liebestod, or transfiguration, as we've seen in Tristan und Isolde. So I'm sure that you can probably see the direct correlation there between the Liebestod from Tristan and the Schlussgesang, the closing song from Salome. Of course, what's interesting is that there's an abrupt and violent ending there, where she is murdered for her perverseness and for her subversion. And unsurprisingly, this opera was greeted with dismay and also with resounding affirmation. It was very much a work of its time. It was banned for its immoral content, for its blasphemous biblical portrayals, for its portrayals of necrophilia, homosexuality, incest, and just generally speaking, open sexuality. And again, I think what's important here is seeing the transformation from 1857 to 59 when Tristan was written, and then a little less than 50 years later from Salome's premiere, this transformation from transcendental thinking to decadent thinking. And I really do feel that this work, more than any of the ones that I have shown tonight, is really a great way to close tonight and a great way to think about the music for coming weeks and the way that music reacts and responds to itself, to the political climate and to art. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. I have resources here, which I'm happy to send if you contact Andre about. Would recommend watching both of these operas if you have the time. And next week we'll be talking about Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Second Viennese School. It'll be a blast.